Welcome to today's webinar, Polyvictimization Reaches Adolescence, Looking Back and Moving Forward. My name is Susan Howley, and I am the Project Director for the Center for Victim Research. This webinar and all activities of the Center are supported with funding from the Office for Victims of Crime at the U.S. Department of Justice. The Center for Victim Research is a partnership between researchers and practitioners at the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. Our mission is to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge to increase access to victim research and data and increase the utility of research and data collection to crime victim services nationwide. And it is my great pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Jakira Mitchell. Professor Mitchell is an assistant teaching professor at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. She teaches courses on child maltreatment, statistics, research methods, and criminal justice systems in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies, and her research interests include childhood victimization, juvenile delinquency, and intimate partner violence. Professor, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Today we're going to be talking about polyvictimization reaching basically the age of adolescence. It's kind of a play on words, and it's because polyvictimization sort of was initiated in 2005 with like the very first article that was published in reference to it, but that was really about testing the instrument that measures it. So in 2007 was sort of like the first empirical study that came from it. So part of the results I'll be sharing with you today are based on two studies that I conducted concurrently. One is a systematic literature review where I look at articles that were published between 2007 and 2017, so like a 10-year review. And the purpose of that is really to inform the research community about like where we stand as of right now. What is the current state of knowledge? And then we have a survey research, which is a nationally representative sample of 10 to 17-year-olds. And the results of that is really supposed to inform practitioners and policymakers as to what we can sort of do about this problem. Okay. But first, a little assessment. Just want to know for yourself, I want to know if you sort of think about this answer. We're going to come back to sort of what your state of knowledge is on your self-perceived state of knowledge on polyvictimization at the beginning of this seminar and then sort of at the end of it. And then I'll ask you a question as to whether or not your level of knowledge has improved as a function of. So sort of like the pretest. So on a scale of 1 to 10, and you can jot this down, you can sort of just keep it in your mind. How much do you think you know or understand about polyvictimization as a condition? And I'll just give you a few seconds to sort of think about that, and then we'll continue on to my next question. Okay. I want to reflect on one more thing before we sort of dive into the material. I want you to think for just 1 minute what you think a polyvictim is. So if you were asked to define this subcategory of victimized children, how would you define it? And I'll give you a few seconds to sort of jot down some ideas, and we'll come back to this later on. You're welcome to put it into the chat, but this is really intended for you to sort of self-assess about what your current state of knowledge is. Okay. So I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I just want to sort of take you through some steps that I had to go through in order to sort of figure out that this is a topic that I want to basically invest the rest of my life to trying to understand. So generally speaking, first, like why is it that that studying, understanding victimization? Well, generally speaking, victimization has a whole host of adverse effects, both in the short and in the long term. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but some of the some of the adverse effects that victimizations have been linked to include anxiety, depression, PTSD, psychiatric diagnoses, cognitive difficulties, social competence problems, and aggressive and delinquent behaviors. So that's one reason why trying to understand victimization is important. But then I wanted to specifically focus on childhood victimization, and I wanted to focus on that subcategory because childhood victimization doesn't seem to be a localized problem. It's not just a U.S. problem. It's not just north or south. It's actually a global public health issue, and therefore merits some conscientious attention. And even when children aren't like the direct targets of victimization, they are often in a position or in a place where they witness victimizations of others. And then, of course, there's a lot of research that has shown that that has an adverse effect on them as well. And research has also shown that some of these kids who are victimized are actually chronically exposed to violence. So it's not just something that happens once or twice, but something that sort of happens over time. And research has also shown that it sort of has a spillover effect into adulthood, not just in terms of experiencing and witnessing, but in the adverse effects that are initiated in childhood are also kind of carried over into adulthood. So that's why I specifically wanted to focus on victimization in general, and then childhood victimization more specifically. But even within victimization, within childhood victimization, I wanted to specifically focus on multiple victimization. So that's because a lot of research has shown that victimizations co-occur, and that there seems to be a dose response, whereas the more a child is victimized, the worse their adverse effects are. And then even within children, I wanted to focus on the multiple victimizations of juveniles, because juveniles have been shown to be 2 to 3 times more likely to be raped, robbed, or assaulted. And all of this brings us to polyvictim, which is a subcategory of multiply victimized juveniles. So for some of these kids, victimization isn't just something that they've experienced and have experienced multiple times, but it sort of becomes a condition of their life, not just an event that happens once or even a couple of times. And then these children tend to endure the highest burden of victimization. And it tends to consist over time, and when you compare all subcategories of victimized youth, this specific category seems to be worse off in terms of a whole host of adverse effects. Now, the focus of this webinar is fourfold. So I want to talk about how polyvictimization has been studied thus far, how prevalent it is, what we know about its adverse effects, and then sort of what can we do about it. One of the things that is, sometimes things are difficult to sort of explain by saying what it is. So I've chosen to talk to you guys about polyvictimization, try to define it by telling you what it is not. One of the most important things a researcher must do is ensure that the consumer of his or her research is accurately capturing the conceptual argument that he or she is making. So spending just a little bit of time on the definition of what it is that we're talking about, I think is important. So I want to point out that polyvictims are not necessarily repeat victims. Repeat victims defined as follows. So somebody who has been physically assaulted at school multiple times, that will qualify as a repeat victim. And the focus of this category of victimization is the frequency. So if you've been notified more than once, you're considered a repeat victim. Now, a repeat victim could experience this condition over time. So, for example, a chronic victim would be somebody whose emotional and physical needs are ignored by his caregiver, and this occurs from 6 to 10 years of age. So the focus on chronic victimization is really the duration of the condition or the exposure. When we're talking about multiple victims, we're talking about people who experience multiple types of multiple forms. So they're either physically assaulted, they're neglected, they're bullied, they're sexually assaulted. But there's a subcategory of multiple victims, which is what polyvictimization is. And even among those kids who are multiply victimized, we have polyvictimized kids. So these are kids who are victimized multiple times, but they reach a specific threshold. And we're actually going to go back to what a specific threshold is, because there's some debate in the field right now. So the focus for polyvictims, which are sort of inherently multiply victimized kids, but the focus is on the diversity of the experience that they are reporting. So it's not just being victimized in 2 forms, but being victimized in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 different ways. And of course, these things do happen over time, so they are inherently repeat victims. Chronic victims. They just happen multiple times, over time, in multiple forms. So really, polyvictims qualify to be classified as all the other ones, but the other ones are not necessarily subsumed into it. So it's sort of like a heightened condition of victimization, and that's why this particular subgroup is of particular interest to me. So how it has been studied, the first focus of the study. I conducted a systematic literature review where I looked at all the articles published between 2007 and 2017 in both English and Spanish, and came up with 267 articles. Now, these 267 articles yielded close to 4,900 citations. These were published, this initial search came up with about 2,900 articles. 91% of these citations, those 4,900 citations, are not self-citations. And that particular article that sort of started it all, it's a Finkel 2007 article, that one has over 557 citations. So it's a highly cited article, and that article is sort of what prompted my interest and my study over this. And you can see that in 2007, there was 5 articles published, and as you go over time, it's not a perfectly linear relationship. You can see that as time progresses, there seems to be sort of an increased interest in this particular subgroup of students to the point where, victims, to the point that in 2017, we have identified about 53 articles with that particular search. And I don't want to spend too much time on it. I just kind of wanted to show you the flow of how I came about the articles I will be summarizing today, but we ended up with 267 articles just at the title, inclusion-exclusion criteria. When we looked at the title, when we looked at the abstracts, we reduced it by about half. Studies that were not empirical, studies that did not, that were corrections or did not focus on the individual unit of analysis were excluded. We ended up with a total of 127 articles, and out of those 127 articles, for purpose of this presentation, 59 of those were randomly selected and summarized moving forward. Some of the descriptives that came out of those 59 articles, so we end up with 59 peer-reviewed articles. They all ended up being in English because the Spanish ones were excluded as we progressed through the inclusion-exclusion criteria. 11 different instruments were used to measure polyvictimization, but the most frequently used was the Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire, which is not surprising given that that was the instrument that was introduced in 2005 prior to sort of the seminal article coming out in 2007. These articles include data, original data collected between 1995 and 2016. So even though these articles were published between 2007 and 2017, some of the data was collected prior to. It includes information collected from 14 different nations, with the U.S. sort of leading the pack with 55% of the studies. And these were published in like 33 different journal articles. So very, very diverse and rich set of data that we'll be reviewing today. So in an effort to, again, define, clarify how polyvictimization has been studied to date, I just wanted to sort of show you that 46 out of those 59, so 79% of those articles were focused on testing the effect of polyvictimization. So polyvictimization as an independent variable, which goes to show that there's probably room for growth in terms of studying the pathways into polyvictimization as compared to sort of understanding the adverse effects of it, which is important, but we sort of need to get into the other side of the equation, where it's like how are children coming into this condition? We understand that this is this is having a pretty significant effect on children, but now we also need to sort of understand what are the pathways out of this condition. So those are, in terms of research efforts that should be followed moving forward. That's definitely an area for growth, an area for focus. So 79% of these were empirical studies that tested the effects of. Only 8 were descriptive, and these bottom 4 rectangles are basically showing that 2 studies looked at polyvictimization as a dependent variable, 2 studies looked at polyvictimization as a control variable, 2 as a moderating variable, and 1 as a mediating variable. So this to me means, again, we need to look at polyvictimization as a dependent variable to understand the pathways in. We need to understand sort of what the dynamic looks like in terms of controlling, how we control polyvictimization, what all those other relationships that we already know about, have studied for years regarding victimization and a whole host of adverse effects, how that dynamic plays out when we control for the effect of polyvictimization. So that's definitely an area that researchers can focus on. And then we need to sort of focus on a more complex analysis of it. Now we definitely understand the adverse effects of it. We have a very good sense of what that's like, but how do we understand sort of what's moderating and mediating these relationships? So all of those are sort of areas of research that we can focus on moving forward. How has polyvictimization been studied in terms of design? The overwhelming majority, 84% of these studies have been quantitative, so clearly indicating that there's a need for qualitative research. There's only 3 studies that looked at polyvictimization in a qualitative way, and these are listed here just for your reference. But there are things that qualitative research allows us to understand that quantitative doesn't, or is difficult to assess in quantitative studies. And in order to design studies moving forward that take into consideration the voices of the individuals who are affected by this condition, then we need to sort of make an effort to look at this qualitatively. 80% of these studies are cross-sectional, indicating that there is a real need to look at this over time, longitudinally. So I found 11 studies that collected data in a longitudinal way, but not all of those that collected data longitudinally reported on data in that way. It's still reported on cross-sectional. So only 9 of those studies collected data in a longitudinal manner and then analyzed it in a longitudinal manner. So another room for growth there. In terms of sample, we're actually doing very well. We have studies that have employed a variety of samples. I mean, national representative samples, high school students, adolescents receiving mental health services, homeless youth, university students, female sex workers, Latino women, child welfare involved youth, gender minority adolescents, a very, very rich and diverse sample types. Most of these studies, however, have focused on adolescents, indicating that, knowing that there is sort of a spillover effect into adulthood, there's sort of a need to move beyond focusing on adolescents and also sort of following them along to adulthood, which also goes along with the need for longitudinal studies. Very few studies have used probability sampling techniques, so maybe we need to increase our efforts at getting representative samples, and a slight majority were non-clinical samples, so indicating there's sort of a balance between clinical and non-clinical samples, which is actually very important. As it pertains to data collection, overwhelmingly self-reports, and when they're self-reports, they tend to be self-administered. Some of them are adult retrospective studies, about 43%. Only 8% have proxy interviews, and less than 2% have multiple informants. So understanding that designing studies with multiple informants is difficult is sort of important. It's important to sort of focus on that, irrespective of how difficult it is to collect data in that way. These are kids, predominantly kids who are between the ages of 10 to 17, and there are efforts to look at their polyvictimization experience reported by the actual child, provided they're old enough to understand the questions. And then there's studies that focus on the parent or a caregiver answering on behalf of that child. But in order to have some triangulation of this information, I think it's important that moving forward, we try to employ or design studies that look at multiple informants at the same time. And those multiple informants can be, doesn't have to be two individuals, can be an individual and then some sort of document or content analysis that can help us understand this better. This slide is a little busy, and to be frank, I have a few that are a little busy, but I just want to bring your attention to the part with the green arrow. I just wanted to show you that there is a wide array of instruments that have been used in these 59 studies that I'm summarizing to assess polyvictimization, but the JVQ, the Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire, is by far the most prevalent, and that's all that was intended to show. And I also wanted you to have access to this so you can sort of dig deeper if it's something that's of interest to you. So that's the focus. That's the first focus, how it's been studied. Now I want to shift a little bit to look at how prevalent it is. So based on the systematic literature review, we have a wide range of prevalence rates. We have as little as 10% in the past year meet criteria for polyvictimization to as high as 66% in the lifetime. And we understand that clinical samples, we can predict, right? We can hypothesize, and studies have shown that clinical samples have greater rates. We can hypothesize, and studies have shown that lifetime rates are going to be greater than past year rates, and generally speaking. And studies have also shown that boys have greater rates of polyvictimization than girls do. This is particularly for the juvenile population. But beyond that, there are some measurement issues that are really plaguing our ability to understand just how prevalent this condition actually is. And that is a function of how we've been defining polyvictimization, which is why I asked in the beginning, if you had to, how would you define, what do you understand it to be, and how would you define it? And that's because that is an actual current condition that we really need to systematically focus on. I'm currently working on and expanding this systematic literature review through 2019 and using additional databases to speak to this particular problem. So that's kind of like the next step. And polyvictimization has been conceptualized in a variety of ways. And I'll just read you some of the ones that are commonly used. So experiencing an above average number of different victimizations, simultaneously experiencing several different kinds of victimizations in separate incidents. Some people specify that has to be a separate incident, other studies do not. The total number of different kinds of victimization, so you have an inventory of possible exposures that the respondent selects yes or no to, and then those yes answers are totaled up, and then that becomes your polyvictimization score. And then high cumulative level of victimization. Like those are very common conceptualizations of polyvictimization across different studies. Now there are some misconceptualizations. And I go back to that slide where I talked to you about repeat, chronic, multiple, and polyvictims. So here are some studies that state that the focus is polyvictimization, but when you look at their measure section, they're actually measuring something else. So someone who has experienced cyber victimization and psychological intimate partner violence, that's not technically a polyvictim. A peer polyvictimization, or so somebody who's victimized just by their peers, whereas polyvictimization by its very nature sort of doesn't require, but has come to be known that the perpetrators tend to be multiple. So it's not just the form of victimization that are multiple, but the perpetrators are multiple, diverse, and different, the types, the locations that these things occur. So it's a very sort of specific reality that needs to be sort of captured very carefully. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to reconcile what it is that we know about polyvictimization if we're actually measuring different things across studies. And that is sort of what I'm focusing on moving forward. And that's why this conceptualization, operationalization issue is so important to me right now. So experienced child maltreatment and witnessing intimate partner violence is not a conceptualization of polyvictimization. And then there's a lot of studies that have chosen to define polyvictimization as more than one type of victimization. And these are sort of not the intended definitions of the researchers when that first sort of 2017 article introduced it to the field. And so one of the real practical issues that need to sort of be addressed in our understanding of this condition is really what are we defining, what are we measuring, and then, of course, what do we understand as a function of that. To sort of show you how, conceptualization sort of leads into operationalization issues, there are sort of two main ways in which polyvictimization has been measured. One is by using a cutoff score or a sum of items score, so like that list, that inventory of victimization, of possible victimization that I talked to you about. And then the other way is empirical, so looking at cluster analyses. Now here I've chosen just for the, for the sake of time and for the purposes of showing this point, I just focus on this type of operationalization. So if we look at, I have two sort of arrows going bidirectionally, where the top is sort of showing you that all the studies that focus on polyvictimization in the past year, they've determined that a cutoff score of 2, from as little as 2 to as high as 10 in order to fit the inclusion criteria for polyvictimization. So anybody who has experienced 2 victimizations in the past year is considered a polyvictim in some studies. But then another study would do the exact same thing, measure the exact same victimizations, but say you have to reach a cutoff of 10. Now that's a significant issue. I mean, when we're reconciling the literature, what are we actually saying? We're not comparing apples to apples, we're comparing apples to oranges. And so the conceptualization issues are really sort of bleeding into the operationalization of the same. And the same thing with lifetime. You have people defining polyvictimization in the lifetime as experiencing 2 or more victimizations in the lifetime, and then to as much as 15. So those, we understand that lifetime exposure would just by logic, and based on research studies, be greater for lifetime than for past year. But yet we see have an overlap in operationalization where past year and lifetime are the same condition. But when we step back and look at reality, and we look at these experiences in kids' lives, I mean, how can we logically conclude that a condition that occurs in the past year is the same as a condition that occurs in the lifetime? So understanding what cutoff score we're going to use is something that we really need to move forward and reconcile this so that we can understand what do we need moving forward. Only one study used an age-graded approach. Basically means that that the cutoff score was adjusted according to the individual's age. So the older you get, the higher the cutoff score that you need to sort of reach to class to be able to be categorized as a polyvictim, and then therefore do analysis based on who's victimized, who's polyvictimized and who isn't. Only 4 differentiated between low and polyvictims. Several studies have done that, but not enough. And then some studies have just focused on the top 10% in order to determine who this polyvictimization is. And again, all of these things are sort of expected given the age of this particular area of research, but we're at the point where, we've reached adolescence. We're older than 10 years old. We're 10, 13, 14, depending on where you start to count. We need to sort of start to reconcile all these things so we understand where we are and where we need to go. So back to the beginning, when I asked you, what are polyvictims? Well, if you had to answer this question, what would you say that it is? I want you to sort of reflect, just look back at your answer, consider what you wrote down or what you thought about, and then think back to what we just discussed, the information we just went over, the conceptualization, the operationalization. And I want you to sort of think about how did your definition of polyvictimization compare to the state of literature? I suspect that there's a variety of answers. But understanding that the field as a whole hasn't quite reconciled what a polyvictim is, it's no wonder that our understanding, our definitions at this point of polyvictimization is as diverse as the literature. So how can we as researchers and practitioners and clinicians, how can we sort of move forward on addressing and understanding this problem if our ideas of what it is that we're studying are completely different? So I want you to really think about what it is that you understand polyvictims to be before we started this webinar, and sort of now that you have this information or this summary, And how does that compare? How does your prior knowledge sort of compare to the state of the literature? And can you see why it's important that we sort of come to some sort of consensus on this? I hope that, thinking that through will sort of propel some people to try to address this particular issue and condition. Now, in terms of prevalence rates for the survey research, sort of the second part of it, I want to sort of summarize the data that I analyzed for the purposes of this webinar. And here, what you're looking at is I integrated 3 different versions, not waves, but 3 different versions of the National Survey of Children Exposure to Violence, which, moving on from here on out, I will refer to as the NATSAV. So it's a national representative sample of children between the ages of 0 to 17. So anybody under the age of 10, information was collected on the age of 9. On the age of 10 was collected from their parents, and 10 to 17 was collected directly from the children. And here, all I'm showing you is that there was 3 versions, NATSAV 1, NATSAV 2, NATSAV 3, collected in 2008, 2011, and 2014, so about 3 years apart, sort of collected this whole data and looked at I'm specifically interested in the effects of polyvictimization on delinquency. But for the sake of prevalence, I just wanted to show you sort of what the data it is that I'm working on. And again, I just want you to have this information to be able to reference later. But 2008, 2011, 2014, about equally distributed across each wave for a total of over 13,000 children. And here, I just mentioned to you that there's a specific measurement issue. And so I wanted to define to you exactly how I operationalize polyvictimization in my research. And here we're looking at polyvictimization among a national sample. Now, this is just for the 10 to 17-year-olds. So I wanted to analyze data that was based on self-reports, not proxy reports, even though studies have shown that there really isn't much to be concerned about empirically. But I wanted to focus on juveniles specifically, and they were old enough to self-report, and my dependent variable of interest sort of necessitated that I focus on the older kids. So I ended up using a 14 cutoff score in the lifetime. So if in your lifetime you have experienced 14 or more different kinds of victimization, now think about this, 14 different types of victimizations in your lifetime. Now, lifetime isn't 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. These are 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old kids who have experienced, in some way, shape, or form, 14 different types of victimization. And how I came about this was basically using a similar method that the first article, the 2007 article, used, which was looking at 1 standard deviation above the mean. That original article looked at past year, so the cutoff score was 4. This one, we're looking at lifetime, and so I went 1 standard deviation above the mean. That gave me a score of 14. And I focused on 44 different types of victimization that were sort of consistent across each of these versions. And it looks like overall, there is about 16% of kids qualify as being polyvictims given this 14 cutoff score. So that's very different from that, as low as 10% to as high as 66% I showed you earlier as a function of the systematic literature review. And there does seem to be some significant difference in terms of race, household income, and family composition. So a summary of the descriptive statistics, it does look like the condition, polyvictimization, was least likely among white non-Hispanics, was least likely among households with high incomes, least likely among households with 2 parents, significantly more likely among families who receive financial assistance, significantly less likely among kids who participate in after-school program, greater for older kids, greater, significantly, all of these are significant, significantly greater for kids who were below average in school or said they didn't like school. And the social support results were not very consistent, but it turns out that the less support these kids tended to have, the higher the likelihood of being sort of classified as a polyvictim. So these are sort of some of the connections that we can possibly pay attention to in order to help identify and address the needs of these children. So now on to focus area number 3 is what we know in terms of its adverse effects. So not surprising, polyvictimization has been linked to a whole host of adverse effects. Some of the same adverse effects that are known in the literature when we're just looking at victimization without sort of going through all those different criteria that you need to meet in order to reach the polyvictimization categorization. But we're talking about psychosocial problems, psychological distress, deliberate self-harm, suicidal ideation, psychological impairment, trauma-related mental health symptoms, alcohol misuse, lower self-esteem, PTSD, dissociation, depression, anger expression, abandonment concerns, academic problems, and then what I focus on is the deviant behavior and delinquency. So several studies have shown that poly victims have greater rates of each of these things than non-poly victims, irrespective of how polyvictimization has been, have been measured, which is, I guess, kind of a good thing, but not necessarily. At least the results in terms of victimization are consistent. That doesn't necessarily mean that our understanding of polyvictimization's effects is as clear. And I wanted to focus on, is the effect of polyvictimization complex, right? So I sort of identified what the need was in the field and how we needed to explore more complex relationships. So this is just one step forward in that direction. And I wanted to see if this varied by gender and whether or not it depended on the type of offense the juvenile was perpetrating. So we're basically looking at the effect of polyvictimization on any delinquency which has been done. What has not been done prior to this is looking at polyvictimization's effect on specific subcategories of delinquency. So delinquency overall, there's a significant amount of support for that, but not necessarily does this sort of pattern play out for property crime only or for personal crime only. In this particular case, assault, psychological, truancy, and weapons possession. Those are the independent variables of interest in my study. And then I wanted to sort of look at whether or not this differed by gender. We'll come back to the controls in just a minute. This is sort of what the information looked like. Again, I just want to draw your attention to certain things, and I've highlighted them for you as best I could. But I just wanted you to be able to have the information so you can sort of analyze it on your own if it's something that you wanted to do. But if we look at here, this table is basically showing us that if you look at the first category, the first column is basically showing us the percentage of kids who engaged in this particular perpetration, this particular delinquent act, as a function of whether or not they met or didn't meet the operationalization of polyvictimization that I used in this study. So whether or not they have been victimized 14 or more times in their lifetime. And it looks like, if we just going to interpret for you the area that I have circled here in blue, is that 31% of non-poly victims self-reported that they have perpetrated at least one delinquent behavior, as compared to just under 79% of poly victims. So while 31% of non-poly victims were delinquent, 79% of poly victims were delinquent. That's sort of our first indication that polyvictimization has an effect on delinquent behavior. And if we look at the category, we see sort of the same pattern. It doesn't matter if we look at any property crime, poly victims had a higher self-report delinquency rate. And even when we looked at subcategories of property crime, we see the same pattern. So property crime, higher for poly victims. Property damage was higher. If we looked at just theft in all different locations, school, home, or store, we looked at significantly higher rates of poly victims. And it was not just limited to property crime, but any assault as well, significantly higher rates for poly victims, truancy, significantly higher rates for poly victims, and drug use and weapons possession. So you can see that the pattern was pretty persistent irrespective of the type of perpetration that we looked at. And the same was true when we looked at the same exact relationships by gender. So if you look down the column for boys, and you look down the column for girls, you see the same exact pattern. Poly victims were more likely to be delinquent in all of these categories and subcategories, irrespective of gender. And I wanted to sort of tease out these categories a little bit more. I wanted to look at All right, so what if we were to split it forward, if we were to split it a little bit further and looked at non-victims, kids who had never been victimized, because in the previous study it was just victims, it was not polyvictims and polyvictims. Here, let's separate out the non-victims, kids who have been victimized but don't sort of meet that cutoff, and then of course polyvictims. And to interpret this, when we're looking at just any delinquency overall, we look like kids who were never victimized, about 7% of those kids engage in some sort of delinquent behavior. There seems to be a dose response where our kids who were victimized, about 34% of those who were victimized but were not polyvictims engage in some sort of delinquent behavior. And again, 79% of those who were polyvictimized were engaged. So there's that same dose response that we've seen in different studies is sort of playing out here as well. The numbers are substantial though, and the same thing goes when we look at boys and when we look at girls. Overall, the more exposure to victimizations you have, the higher the likelihood of being, the higher the proportion of kids who said that they engaged in delinquent behaviors, but by a significant amount. We're talking about from 7% to 40% to 83% for boys, to just under 8% to 34% to 79% in girls. It's a pretty precipitous increase. And so if we're really concerned about the adverse effects of victimization and this sort of, cycle of violence sort of repeating itself, sort of in a different, using it in a different context from like intimate partner violence. But if we really want to address the issues of victimization, then we sort of need to be concerned about, okay, so these kids in particular tend to also be perpetrators. Then in a prevention effort to in order to prevent their perpetrations on other people, then we sort of need to address their needs now. So it's sort of addressing the needs of polyvictims doesn't just help them, it also helps the people in the future who might have become their victims. So going back to the original question, whether or not this relationship is complex, we basically see that polyvictimization has a pretty strong effect on delinquency regardless of how we measure it, and regardless of the gender. But now I want to focus on what the results look like when we put in controls, right? Because that was just, chi-squares with no controls. This one is sort of looking at logistic regression. Same sort of line. I understand that there's a lot on the screen right now, but it's for you to sort of revisit later. But I just want to show you that when we look at the first column under overall, and we look to the odds ratio column, we can see that overall polyvictims were from as little as twice to as much as 9 times more likely to engage in some sort of delinquent behavior as compared to a non-polyvictim. So if the percentages weren't good enough or not having controls was sort of a source of concern, now we can see how even after controls, even after controlling for the usual suspects, age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, family structure, lifetime adversity, conduct disorder, and community disorder, polyvictimization still has a significant effect on delinquency, and is all sorts of delinquency, regardless of the category and irrespective of gender. So so the last question that I sort of want to go into is, okay, so we understand that polyvictimization tends to have an adverse effect on delinquency. So kids who are polyvictimized are more likely to be delinquents. But I wanted to see, okay, so we understand that this is a pretty consistent sort of a finding, but is it robust? Does it stay even after we control for not just the usual suspects, but control for other types of victimizations? So we ended up doing is controlling for all types of victimization that these kids could have been exposed to, and then put in polyvictimization last in the model, so it's in the most disadvantageous position. And it turns out that even when we put in polyvictimization last, after sort of all the variance has been explained by other types of victimizations, which we know to be the case, polyvictimization was still a significant predictor of all sorts of delinquent behavior. So to summarize these findings, victimization seems to increase the probability of delinquency overall for about five times more likely. And then, from as little as 2 to as high as 8.6, depending on the specific type. As victimization increases, so does delinquent behavior. It didn't matter the type of delinquency that we looked at. The gender didn't matter, and whether or not we did with or without controls. So polyvictimization was not just a persistent predictor of delinquency, but also the strongest by virtue of that very last analysis that I very briefly presented to you. So there's still, this is great. This is good information, but there's still a large degree of variance in terms of explaining these relations that we need to sort of explain. So this is not the cure-all, but it does sort of help us understand this relationship a bit more. This is the last sort of point, the focus areas. Okay, so what can we do about this? So understanding all of these different dynamics, what kinds of things should we be thinking about moving forward? So these are some of the recommendations that I've made, and this is not necessarily new, but just sort of in the context of polyvictimization. So looking at this issue broadly, because by definition it's broad and complex, and so solutions that aren't reciprocal in terms of complexity or broad or far-reaching are probably not going to be sufficient. So prevention programs that help teach skills for coping with prior victimization, along with family-based interventions, not just individual ones, are things that can sort of help attending to risk and protective factors as a way to minimize risk and increase protective factors. Looking at the social network and parent-child relationships, a lot of studies sort of have shown that, actually I don't want to go down that line because I want to be sensitive to time, but if you have stronger family-child relationships, and some of these sort of issues, at least the ones outside of the family, can be can be identified earlier, which then can sort of, in theory, prevent the pathway into polyvictimization. So the complexity of outcomes may require longer treatment plans and follow-up services. So just as you need to broadly address this issue, you need to understand that it took a while for this condition to sort of manifest itself. And so how we treat it, what treatment plans we develop and think about and try to implement, those sort of need to be sensitive to the idea that it took a long time to get into it. It's probably going to take a long time to get out of it. Connecting youth with positive resources. One of the issues with polyvictimization is that these kids don't have a safe place, right? If they're victimized at home, they're victimized at school, they witness violence as they step out of their neighborhood, there's just this ongoing condition where they don't feel safe anywhere. So if as program directors or interventions, if we can sort of come up with creating safe spaces for these kids, then maybe we can ameliorate some of the adverse effects that these kids are dealing with. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, target mediating variables, but of course we can't target mediating variables until we sort of get to understand them a little better. Early intervention it's a need, so we need to have sort of prevention efforts as well as intervention efforts. Better screening processes and instruments. That's something that we need to sort of, that's an area of research that needs to sort of figure, is the JVQ the absolute best instrument for it? And is it practical? Is it practical to sit down and have a practitioner or a clinician have a child go through 44, 52 different types of victimization to sort of this battery of questions? Is that practical? So we need to be able to sort of figure out a way to come up with an instrument that is both empirically sound, but yet practical in the field. So broadly assess victimization and violence exposure. That sort of goes along with the issue of needing to determine what is the best instrument for this. And we cannot do this alone. So we absolutely positively need to develop collaborations and partnerships where these partnerships are focused on sharing information, coordinating treatment plans, and screening for these chronically victimized kids. So if we can sort of find ways to share each other's resources, then maybe we can have a better impact. Professional trainings on having people understand what the condition of polyvictimization is definitely a need. And then, of course, having blended treatment. And this is a little sensitive, but is it possible, given these results, that in programs that are specifically designed to address delinquency, that we also sort of address the issues of victimization. So those kids who are delinquent, what about looking back at their victimization history? Now that one I think people are more sensitive to, but the other one, I think there's a little bit of a struggle. There's a little bit of a sort of a pushback where it's like, okay, what about programs that are designed to deal with people's victimization experiences? What about looking at their potential delinquent behavior? Those are things that need to be addressed with care, but given these results, I don't think that we can address one issue without sort of looking at the other, given the how prevalent these studies have sort of shown themselves to be. These two variables, delinquency perpetration and victimization, how prevalent these things seem to sort of be together. Not to mention, you know, studies that have shown that there is a bidirectional relationship. Now, we have a lot showing that victimization leads to delinquency, but we have a lot showing in the opposite direction. And we have a very, very small number of studies that sort of show that, you know, the relationship is actually bidirectional. So shouldn't our program sort of address this bidirectional relationship? So sort of to wrap up, I want to go back to the very first question I asked you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think you know or understand about polyvictimization now? So think back to the number that you wrote down or thought about at the beginning of the class, and then think now about how, what's your sort of self-assessment of your knowledge base for this particular condition. And I want to ask you is, has your knowledge, as a function of this webinar, has your knowledge about polyvictimization increased? And if it has, just hit that green check button. And if it hasn't, just click the X, and then hopefully I can use that information to figure out how to do this better, how to raise awareness about this topic better. And we'll look at those results moving forward. So some time for reflective questions. And I'm gonna leave you with these questions. And these are for things that hopefully you can think about, hopefully talk about with your colleagues, and hopefully just find these questions to be sort of maybe not transformative in your thinking. I would love for them to be transformative in your thinking, but if you just get you to think about how to incorporate this in your day-to-day life, then I feel like I've done my job. So do your day-to-day practices or interventions address the need of polyvictims? Just think about what you do on a day-to-day basis, whether you're a researcher, clinician, practitioner. Are the things that you're doing addressing the needs of this particular subgroup of kids? Also want you to think about how detailed is your intake process for those of you who are in the field. Does the system or the form that you use allow you to identify these polyvictims? How can we modify what we have in able to do that? So asking people to reinvent the wheel is just not practical. Asking people to abandon what they do and sort of take on a new thing, it's not a practical recommendation. So all I'm asking is think about what you do, think about how you collect this information, and then think about how can you modify what you have now in order to be able to get to a point where polyvictims are something, that you're identifying and are able to sort of respond to. So what are sort of the 5 or 6 maybe additional questions that you can add to what you're already using that can sort of make this happen? So what small modifications can we make to make a big difference in our day-to-day practice and our effect on this condition? Does your program, intervention, agency, do they target a range of victimization, or is it sort of focused on just one? And if so, how can we sort of form collaborations with other groups who look at other types of victimizations that can sort of help us address the needs of these kids? There are a substantial number, and there is substantial need. And we already know that the adverse effects of this condition are very unfortunate. And so how can we change our day-to-day practices so that we can identify, respond, and help these kids, support these kids is a better terminology, support them in the best way that we can. And that's all I have in terms of presentation. I'd be more than happy to answer your question.
That's great. Thank you so much. I know I have learned a lot, and we have had quite a few questions come in. So folks, go ahead and keep entering your questions in the chat box. We're also going to go ahead and launch the exit poll now for those of you who do have to leave. Please take that exit poll before you go, because we do have to report the results of all of our webinars to our funder. But let's turn to some of the questions that have already come in, Professor. And I'll start with one of those that was the most recent. Back when you began showing the link between polyvictimization and delinquency, we had a question about, are there any important differences or nuances between ACE scores and polyvictimization and then their link to delinquency? Because I know there has been some discussion just looking at the adverse childhood effects and delinquency.
Yes, so both the studies that have used the ACE questionnaire and studies that have used the JVQ in order to assess polyvictimization, they find very similar findings in terms of, the higher the exposure to victimization or to adverse effects, because the ACE score doesn't just measure victimization. It measures victimization and other adverse life events like divorce or exposure to like natural disasters. The ACE score sort of collapses those different things. The JVQ has a much longer sort of inventory of items, but they're specifically focused on victimization. So it's one of the most significant differences between ACE, which take victimization and other adverse effects into the same sort of instrument, and the JVQ, which just focuses on victimization, but it's got more possible answers. Most studies that use the ACE score, they tend to ask adults to look back on their experience. Most studies that look at JVQ tend to ask adolescents about what has happened to them in sort of the recent past. So there's sort of like a longer sort of time difference, which means a longer recall, memory recall issue with the ACE score, with the ACE studies as opposed to the JVQ. So those are like the big ones, but they both show that a dose response is evident. Both sort of instruments show that that relationship. The other thing I wanted to say about that. I can't recall the other thing. There's one more. I just can't recall what that other one is.
Well, feel free to chime in when it occurs to you. Now stepping back to much earlier in the presentation, I think we can all appreciate how hard a struggle or how hard a challenge it was to really come up with a definition for polyvictimization, because as our awareness has grown, the definition has gotten kind of loose, across different fields and, different examinations. But help us understand why being physically assaulted and neglected doesn't count as, doesn't make someone a polyvictim. We understand the significance of neglect, and is it because of who the perpetrator is, or explain a little bit more about that?
Okay. I actually remembered what the last thing was. Okay. let's just move on to this one. But in terms of the definition of polyvictimization sort of not being not having sort of a consensus. And again, I want to reiterate the fact that this is a relative, in comparison to other areas of research, this is still young, right? We're talking about this area of research sort of reaching adolescence, not yet adulthood. And so I suspect that as we move forward, we will have sort of a better understanding of what constitutes a polyvictim versus not. So that I feel like that's going to happen. I guess what I'm trying to do here is sort of bring attention to that issue now so that we can get to that place faster, right? So that's sort of like the one thing about definitions and looseness and sort of where we are in the field. But the reason why, there's different reasons why somebody who has been who has been victimized in 2 different ways doesn't meet the criteria for polyvictimization is because this is supposed to be the worst of the worst in terms of victimization experience. So it's not just children who are victimized in 1, 2, or even 3 ways in the past year. The way that the polyvictimization condition was defined initially was 1 standard deviation above the mean. The mean at that point in the past year happened to be 3. 1 standard deviation above that happened to be 4. So that was a very sort of, semi-empirical, semi-logical definition of polyvictimization. But even studies that have looked at it without using the cutoff score, that have looked at it didn't really get into it too much because, in the interest of time. But the studies that have chosen to define polyvictimization by looking at cluster analyses, all of these studies, well, I'm not going to say all because I don't want to be incorrect in saying this, but most of these studies that try to define polyvictimization being more empirical and sort of less subjective, those have also differentiated the subgroup of kids who are the most victimized as having 2, 3, 4, 5, well, not 2, I'm sorry, having higher exposure to victimization in terms of types and forms. So whether we define it sort of like logically and subjectively or we define it empirically, 2 does not meet the criteria. Now, how did they go about meeting this criteria? Well, they looked at the adverse effects of it. So they looked at different sort of clusters, and they looked at when the adverse effects sort of peaked. And there is sort of this magic number where adverse effects are progressively growing, just like the ACE score shows, but then there's this one point where the effect grows stronger. And that happened to be, in the study that I'm thinking about, happened to be at like the 7 mark. And this has also been done for age graded. So it's accumulation of knowledge where we have shifted away from, okay, well, this sort of makes sense, and we're going to go 1 standard deviation above the mean, to looking at really empirically, looking at like where do the effects really seem to be significantly different in terms of progression or in terms of severity. And that is sort of the cutoff that has been used, the demarcation point that has been used in order to identify these highly victimized children, thinking that we want to sort of be able to, in a world where we have limited resources, we want to be able to identify who needs to be prioritized. And the argument is these kids, because of their exposure and because of the adverse effects that they experience and because of the likelihood of perpetrating against other people, like these need to be the front line. Not neglecting anybody else, but just sort of addressing the biggest bleed, right? Sort of like triaging in an ER.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in, once a person is, particularly does a poly-victimized child grow up thinking that that is normal, that this is the way life should be, so that in adulthood the person might be, the question says, seeking the same type of person or allowing victimization to occur without realizing why they are that way. Does that make sense?
It does. That's a great question. Actually, a question I've been trying to figure out how to sort of get at. So one of the things that I'm personally concerned about is, so I'm sort of advocating for, based on the research results, that we've sort of identified these kids. And one of the ways in which we identify these kids is by using these instruments and asking them about their exposure. And one of the things that I, sort of tug at my heart, I am a researcher, but I am a human being, is that I don't want to place people in a position where they didn't realize that their condition was such that that is of concern to a lot of other people. So I guess I didn't want to make them, I was concerned about how their awareness of their condition was going to affect them, because there is research to support that at some point it becomes a condition that it sort of doesn't, there comes a point where there's just nothing more. there's nothing more that can add on. That you've sort of reached a tipping point where any sort of additional victimization isn't going to be effective. I have not figured out how to test that. There are not a lot of studies within the context of polyvictimization to address that, but I feel like that is definitely something that we need to take into consideration. Is there a point where exposure to more victimization no longer has an effect? I suspect that there is. I don't believe that there is any research out there to show us exactly where that is. I'm not sure that answers the question fully.
Well, that has certainly given us a lot to think about, because it is very complex. Here's another question that should be easier to answer. When you looked at the demographics of the victims, did any of the studies look at youth that were LGBT or T?
One study that I can recall did. It looked at sexual minorities. I do not recall exactly how it was defined, and I'd have to go back and figure out what year that is, because of course that area of study has sort of shifted over the years. But one study in particular did look at polyvictimization for sexual minorities, and I do not, like I said, I don't remember how sexual minorities was defined, and I don't remember which operationalization of polyvictimization they actually used.
Okay.
So one that I know of.
Have there been any brain or functional MRI studies done on individuals suffering from polyvictimization? Any look at how trauma changes the brain in this context?
Yes, there has been. There have been polyvictimization studies that have looked at the functioning of the brain. And the results are as expected. Kids who are polyvictimized have less functional abilities, or have the same sort of areas that are affected by victimization. The frontal lobe. I am not a neuroscientist, but I forgot the name. But yes, there are actually there are certain areas in the brain that seem to be less functional when you compare polyvictims to non-polyvictims. So there has been, not a lot has been done in that area, but there has been some, I think 2 or 3 that I can recall.
Okay. We had a question, what resources do you have or know of related to applying effective practices or interventions in the day-to-day? And while you're thinking, I'll let people know that we will also here at CVR ask around, and we will include links that we come across when we post this video, or when we post the video from this webinar.
There are very few studies that specifically focus on the effectiveness of responding to polyvictimization. So I guess at this point, we would just have to use the resources that are available for victimization in general, and then try to sort of tailor it to, sort of multiply victimized kids. Like those recommendations that I made at the end, those things haven't been tested. We're just not there yet. We're sort of we're still in adolescence. I do not recall any studies that have focused on this treatment is best for polyvictims. Not that I'm aware of.
Another question just came in. It starts with an observation that so much of research is siloed. So sexual violence researchers study just sexual violence, and IPV just studies IPV. How can we do a better job of integrating research? Are you aware of a toolkit that exists to inform each group of the ways in which their research overlaps?
I'm not aware of a toolkit. I'm hoping that this webinar and all the different people that study polyvictimization and sort of raise awareness about this issue, that it sort of propels other people to sort of start to collaborate. This term was introduced basically as an observation of that condition, the fact that we are so siloed, not just in practice but in research. And until research sort of shifts, there's going to be sort of very little shift in practice. And so research, I am not aware of a toolkit. I know that there's a lot on the University of New Hampshire website that can be used, but in terms of a specific toolkit, I am unfortunately not aware of that. I think just raising awareness of the condition and then having, publishing this or presenting this information about what we know and what we need to do to move forward, and letting people know sort of what the gaps are in the literature, that sort of, initiates collaborative efforts, not just across types of victimization, but across fields. We're not going to be able to address a social complex, a complex social issue by sort of sticking to our sort of individual areas. We need to be interdisciplinary, collaborative, and share information so that all the perspectives come to the table so we can actually address this issue.
I will say I have seen a toolkit of sorts from the CDC that looked at across areas of violence prevention and where the overlap was. So maybe at some point, I know there's been some discussion of overlap in response, but not really that I've seen for the research in perpetration or victimization of these different areas. But I think there is definitely a need, and hopefully we're moving toward that. Another question has come in. Are people currently treating polyvictimization as complex trauma?
I think in the literature, right, because that's where I live. In the research, that's one of the issues or concerns that I've come across in terms of how polyvictimization is measured. This actually goes back to the question about ACE versus JVQ, is that, yes, there's a lot of sort of integration of not just victimizing, not just exposure to victimization, but exposure to other traumatic exposures, which is kind of what complex trauma is, and then sort of looking at polyvictimization exclusive of that. So this is, it's a very sort of, maybe in practice, may not make so much sense to make those differentiations, but in research, it does make sense to look at, okay, how much of this is due to victimization? How much of this is due to trauma exposure? And this actually brings me back to the piece that I forgot last time, which is that even among the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, the NACSEV, there is an inventory of victimization, but there's also an inventory of lifetime adversities. And what the polyvictimization literature shows is the effect of polyvictimization controlling for the effects of lifetime adversity. So those are included in the analyses. They're just not included in the instrument, if that makes any sense. So complex trauma and ACEs, as far as I understand, does not make that differentiation. So they're looking at both things. Both sort of sides of it are looking at both. Complex trauma are looking at it sort of together, and ACE study looking at it together. Polyvictimization is looking at polyvictimization independent of lifetime adversities, but not necessarily forgetting that it exists. It's just sort of using it as a control variable.
All right. Someone wants to know, what would your elevator pitch of polyvictimization be? How can all of us quickly explain to other people what polyvictimization is?
Okay. What I often say is that there's a subset of children who are highly victimized. And these kids tend to be victimized in a variety of ways, by a variety of people, in a variety of contexts. And studies have shown that the adverse effects on these kids seems to exceed the adverse effects of kids who are either not victimized or victimized to a less extent. And so we need to sort of focus our limited resources on the kids that need the help the most, so that then we prevent other kids from getting to that condition.
Great. All right. I think we are at the end of our questions from the audience. So I want to just convey our gratitude. This was so in-depth, and I think that we all learned so much from your presentation today. I did get one question: how can we cite this presentation or your review of the literature? If you can give us a formal citation, we'll be sure to include it when we send out the link.
Okay, this hasn't been published, but we can definitely do a citation for the presentation.
All right. Well, it's high time for it to be published. Really, you have done so much good work here. I really think that I speak for all of us that that we are so grateful for your time and pulling this together and helping us understand this under-examined area of victimization.
Thank you very much.
All right, goodbye everyone. Thanks. To remember to take that exit poll on your way out and look for the email with the link to today's presentation, the slides, and any additional information. Goodbye everyone.